Dr. Richard Gallenstein, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, this is an incredible pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having me.
I've been really looking forward to this, as we've got free advertising for Word on Fire here.
That's right.
Totally not sponsored, but if they want to sponsor it, they can. We're going to be talking about Catholic social teaching
Excellent.
today, which I think is like the best kept secret in the Catholic Church. I think people should talk about it more, and I'm going to do my part here to get Catholics talking about it more, even though I'm myself not Catholic. So one of the things that draws me to Catholic social teaching, there's a lot, but one thing is its ability to kind of break our traditional categories of left and right, the things that kind of polarize us in the church. And one way this shows up also, though, is I think in the church we often have this conception of there are like the doers, the people who like get their hands dirty with like social justice work, not hands dirty in like a bad way,
Right.
but like, you know, being the hands and feet of God in the world. They're serving the poor, they're doing that work. And then there's the kind of like the preachers of the gospel, you know, there's the people who are into evangelism on the one hand, or we've got like the actives and the contemplatives, all these kinds of dichotomies that we make. And I think Catholic social teaching allows us to kind of transcend some of those. But I'd be curious your perspective on how Catholic social teaching might help us bridge some of those gaps. How can it be both like a service to the world, but also a preaching of the gospel?
Yeah. Oh man, that's a perfect question. Really well stated. And I absolutely agree with the problem, right? It sure seems in a lot of cases that there is that division. And I think maybe I'll pick that up in a couple of ways. I mean, just briefly, the perspective, the paradigm of Catholic social teaching doesn't see that tension. In fact, it would say that preaching the gospel and living it out in the social order, that they're intimately or integrally linked with each other, that they need each other. And this is repeated throughout the tradition. But maybe to kind of lay a foundation for that, and perhaps for some other thoughts that we'll get to, maybe I could do kind of a brief like scriptural buildup, kind of to contextualize Catholic social teaching.
I love it. Let's do it.
So I think maybe I'll kind of start looking at Genesis, and there's a lot of fascinating themes in Genesis, especially in the creation account, and they come up again and again in Catholic social teaching. And they come up again and again, I think exactly because they do such a good job of establishing kind of a Christian anthropology, a Christian understanding of the human person. And in Catholic social teaching, everything centers around a deep and authentic understanding of the human person. So let's go there first. I'm just going to kind of bullet point a couple of observations. So we know in the creation account, right, that God creates humanity in his image, right? Man and woman, he created them in his image. Okay. And so humans, we carry the imago Dei, right? The image of God. And that communicates something about us, right? That we have a transcendent dignity. And we'll see that dignity, you know, as a thread running through Catholic social teaching. But even beyond the dignity that confers, it also implies a mission, right? It implies a purpose. We are to be God's representatives in creation, right? And so, and then we see God kind of lay out exactly what that mission implies, what that mission means, right? You know, he says, have dominion. He says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Right, and maybe we'll come back to the words subdue and dominion. They have a negative connotation to our ears today, but that's not the biblical connotation. But, and you know, God commands Adam to work and to keep the garden, right? And the garden is this place of meeting, this touch point between God and humanity, right? And God walks in the garden, and you get this image in Genesis that God is giving humanity a mission to kind of spread the garden to the rest of creation. Right, so there's this mission, really we might say a social mission, embedded at the foundation of the human person, right, and God's creation. Okay, and then even more, right? So God brings all of the animals to Adam and lets Adam name the animals. Which I don't know if people overlook this. I kind of think can be overlooked sometimes. How profound that is, right? Adam names the animals. God invites humanity into creative participation in his lordship of creation. And that speaks volumes about human dignity and our mission and our purpose and like what God is preparing for humanity and the role that humanity plays. Okay, So I say all of that to kind of grab a few themes that I think we'll pull from, but maybe just to summarize, we see human dignity, a transcendent dignity, and a mission, a ministry to be God's representatives. Okay, and then fast forward, you see Abraham and Sarah, right? And God gives a promise to Abraham that through his offspring, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Right? And you can see that kind of as a thread running from Genesis, up to Abraham, right? That there's this mission. Humanity has this mission to go out into the world, to conform the world to God's will, and to have creative participation in living that out. Okay, now who is the offspring? Well, we know the offspring, the ultimate, in the fullness of time, the offspring is Jesus. Right? And so as members of the church, as people who are in Christ, we participate in that promise. We participate in that living out this mission to be a blessing to all the nations. And I like to view Catholic social teaching like within that lens, right? The church, Christ, becomes incarnate and inaugurates the church, right? And the church has this mission to go and live this out in the world, to proclaim the gospel and to live it out as a blessing to the rest of creation. And so this blessing, this social mission, is knit, integrally with the mission of the church to be a blessing to all the nations, which of course includes the proclamation of the good news that Christ is King and Savior. And also a good news that God is doing something in the world to spread the garden, right? To be a blessing to all the world, right? And so, kind of conceptualizing in that context, I think we can look at Catholic social teaching as this call to live out that mission. And so you see it throughout Catholic social teaching. And actually, maybe here I'll just pause for a second. When I'm using the word Catholic social teaching, I'll say I'm referring to like modern Catholic social teaching, which began with Pope Leo XIII. He wrote a letter to the Church, which we call an encyclical, right? And this encyclical was called Rerum Novarum, and it launched this great tradition in the Catholic Church of popes writing these encyclicals on social topics, on Catholic social teaching. And, popes have continued to do that. Pope Leo XIV is preparing to launch, a social encyclical. So, okay. So in that tradition, the tradition of these encyclicals, the popes again and again reiterate the social mission of living out the gospel. And, Pope John Paul II wrote one of these letters actually on the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, and it's a very nice one. I highly recommend.
Was that like Centesimus?
Yeah, Centesimus. Yeah, that's right. And he takes up this question explicitly, and he says that that we're called to evangelize Catholic social teaching because it helps us to understand how our work and our struggle for justice in the social order, right, in the economy, in the political world, right, how that work is bound up in our mission to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so Catholic social teaching really helps us to rise above that divide. And I think it helps to illustrate that kind of these two opposites are both deficient in a certain sense. If we say, okay, I'm going to strive for social justice, but I'm not going to proclaim the name of Jesus on one side, and then on the other side, I'll proclaim the name of Jesus, and I don't have to worry about, let's say, social justice. I know it can be a charged term nowadays, but and the tradition really rejects that dichotomy. Like on this side, to work for social justice, but not to proclaim the name of Jesus. In the tradition, in the Catholic social tradition, the popes will say that there is no genuine solution to social problems apart from the gospel of Jesus Christ. There is no solution. So to pursue social justice and exclude the proclamation of the saving work of Jesus Christ is to deprive that work of the foundation of the justice, right? It lacks its foundation, right? But then, of course, on the other side, if we are proclaiming proclaiming the name of Jesus, proclaiming the good news, and that isn't lived out, if it isn't felt, experienced, manifested among the poor and the marginalized, right? If it's not experienced tangibly, then there's a threat to the integrity of that proclamation.
Yeah.
Right. So anyways, I think it helps to transcend that divide. And more. I don't know if you want to touch on kind of political divides, but maybe I'll rest it there. Yeah.
Well, we'll get to that in a second. Yeah.
Okay.
What I hear, kind of just pulling on a thread that you had in that conversation there that I think is really helpful, is what the social teaching tradition gives us, I think, is a faith that has to be more than just an idea.
Yes.
Like it can't just be a proposition about who Jesus is, or even like an interiorized sense of trust, as important as those two things are. Like they're not opposed to propositions. Right. They're not opposed to a sense of trust, but just as Jesus took on flesh, it's our faith should take on flesh insofar as it should make a tangible difference in the world. Is that a fair way of kind of coming at that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, I hope you guys are enjoying this video, but one thing I know people don't always enjoy is the ads that go with these videos. Now look, ads are how YouTubers like me are able to pay the bills, but if you want to watch these videos early, ad-free, and with my post-show reflections at the end, you can do so by becoming a patron at any tier by going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. From $7 a month to $100 a month, your support helps this channel keep going and growing. And not only will you get early ad-free access to these interviews, but you will also get access to the Gospel Simplicity book club, where we read the church fathers together, and it is an absolute blast. So if you want those perks and others, go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the truth of Christianity, the truth of an authentically Christian anthropology, is a truth that is itself liberating. Like it is actually liberating, right? So if we just think about the Imago Dei, right? Being made in the image of God, that has social implications. If it weren't for that, we would not have ended slavery, right? Like that has tangible implications that help us to realize who we are, help us realize our mission, but then it helps to transform society. It's really difficult. I mean, I would argue probably impossible to have any coherent understanding of human rights apart from an acknowledgement of a transcendent God who created us in his image with transcendent dignity, right? And so, human rights are very common, very popular. People advocate for human rights. People pursue, justice on the basis of human rights. But without that foundation, without that truth, it's really hard to have a foundation for those ideas, right? So all I mean here is that the truth itself is integral to the justice, right? Yeah. They're not separate. They have to be together. Yeah.
Yeah, and they mutually reinforce one another in that way, which I think is a really beautiful thing.
Yeah.
On the context of kind of dichotomies, I think one of the ones that comes up a lot with Catholic social teaching that I was really intrigued to ask you, specifically because your background is in economics.
That's right. Yeah.
Is that you'll hear it said something like Catholic social teaching rejects both capitalism and socialism.
Yeah.
And some people love that.
Right.
They're like, oh yes, reject them both.
Yep.
And some people are like, well, does it really reject both of them in the same way? What's your take on this?
Yeah. Okay. That's great. No, it's a really good question. And really, this question of socialism versus capitalism has captivated the world for, 150 years. And really Catholic social teaching, was launched in the midst of that conversation. So in Rerum Novarum, the first modern social encyclical, Pope Leo XIII addressed this question directly. Okay, so this is a very, very relevant kind of framing. So let me kind of mildly define the terms and kind of set up a spectrum, and then I'll comment on some insights from Catholic social teaching. So let's say that on one side we have socialism. All right, what's socialism? I'll kind of define this spectrum in terms of who has the right and the authority over kind of let's say the means of production, right? The productive part of the economy. Okay. So in socialism, the community, which ultimately is the state, the government, will control a lot, if not all, of the means of production. Okay. And so that means that the state is making choices about, what companies will exist, what are they going to produce, right? It commands and it controls the economy. Okay. On the opposite end of the spectrum, let's say we have capitalism, and capitalism affirms the rights of individuals or, groups like in corporations or families to own the means of production, own kind of the productive part of the economy, and therefore exercise authority over it, right? So to make free choices about how to, what companies people want to start and what they're going to produce and what they're going to sell. And so we can think of, capitalism kind of within that paradigm of free exchanges within the economic domain. Okay, so if we define the spectrum in those terms, well, what I think we see in Catholic social teaching is a pretty strong rejection of true socialism. Okay, and I can kind of elaborate on why. I can go into a few points on that in a minute if you'd like. The capitalism side of the story is a little bit more nuanced. So the social encyclicals, they very clearly reject what they call unbridled liberalism.
Okay.
So this would be kind of a perspective towards the economy that let's say absolutizes the market or conceptualizes the human person as being radically autonomous, and where their freedom is oriented towards just meeting whatever their desires are. Like a vision of the free market that doesn't have any constraints on it, doesn't, we might say, okay, the government just enforces contracts and that's it. National defense and contract enforcement, and nothing else. And that is where the church kind of cautions that extreme side of the economy, but really of capitalism, and really kind of the perspective on the human person that can undergird certain, let's say, versions of capitalism. But the capitalism side is a little bit more nuanced, and we can go a little bit more into that if you'd like. So should I go deeper? Should I talk about kind of like why does it reject socialism? Or
I think before we do that,
Yeah.
I think there's a question that maybe we should address that some people might have at this point.
Yes.
As we talk about the Catholic Church's teaching on socialism or on capitalism, I imagine there's maybe not a ton, but at least some people out there who are going like, wait a second, like what is the church doing talking about economics? Like stay in their lane, like stick to faith and morals kind of thing.
That's right.
So maybe can we talk about, as we get into maybe why they reject these things, also like on what grounds, like why are they talking about this in the first place?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's an excellent question. So in the encyclicals, you see the popes kind of engaging that question. And really what the popes indicate is like it is outside the church's purview to directly prescribe, specific economic political structures. Okay, so it's not about saying, here the economy has to be exactly like this or it has to be exactly like that. What the church claims is that it has a deeply true insight on the human person and the ends of the human person. Like, what is it that we're about? What is it that we're trying to do? What is it we're trying to accomplish, including socially? And so the church is kind of lending its wisdom to help the faithful to discern some of these questions. So really, it's kind of giving us guardrails rather than specific prescriptions. And then it becomes the task of the laity and the task of people kind of trained in these areas to wisely discern exactly how to live out the social mission of the church within those guardrails, let's say. And so you get these principles from Catholic social teaching. But then it takes a lot of kind of wise discernment to try to figure out how exactly do we apply these principles to any specific problem.
Yeah, that's helpful. And so I think within this, there's this aspect of, okay, why are they talking about this in general? But I think also there's maybe a implicit assumption that people have that I'm curious if Catholic social teaching either explicitly or implicitly rejects, and that is that certain spheres of life, like economics, are just amoral. It's not as though like capitalism, socialism, they're neither good nor bad. It's just not, let the markets be.
Yeah.
It seems as though Catholic social teaching wants to maybe challenge us on this idea of things being not immoral, but amoral, like morality not pertaining to them. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I think the wisdom of Catholic social teaching is really kind of pointing out that the way that we engage in the social order has a moral texture. Like the choices that we make as consumers, the choices that we make as producers, like when we start a company, when we, if we lead a company, right? If we're in the productive side of the economy, or when we make consumer choices, that these are moral opportunities, right? That kind of, as I mentioned earlier, Pope John Paul II kind of touched on this, that Catholic social teaching helps us to live out the gospel exactly in our spheres of life in which we're engaged in work and in which we're engaged in kind of the political order. And so the simple answer is yes. Like, it affirms that these are moral choices. Our economic lives are just as much a part of our moral lives as other parts of our lives. Yeah.
And I think that's important, right? Because we don't want our faith to just be relegated to, say, an hour every Sunday or something, right?
Yes.
Or maybe 3 minutes before meals or something like that.
Exactly.
It's something that encompasses all of it.
That's right.
Which I think for a Christian should actually be good news, even if it might initially. I think often people get a little defensive when they feel as though faith is encroaching upon areas in which they thought it wasn't going to be.
Yeah.
Be that areas of their personal lives and the choices they make, or be that in, the areas of economics and your work and all of this. But actually, I think once we sit with that, it would be good news if there's good news for all of those areas too, right?
Yes,
But so with that in mind, with some of that kind of ground tilled up, I do want to come back to capitalism and socialism, because maybe some of these principles will help us understand why it seems socialism is almost rejected like carte blanche, like just don't go there, while capitalism seems to be given a slightly different treatment. But could you give some details on why that is?
Yeah, let's dive in. That's great. Okay, so let's start with socialism. So there are some pretty clear reasons why the church is so concerned with socialism. So the first modern social encyclical, Rerum Novarum, 1891, this was before any great country had adopted socialism, right? And Leo XIII is critiquing it, and then these critiques are kind of carried forward through the tradition. So why? So one, maybe I'll go through a handful, and I don't claim this is exhaustive, but one is that socialism was really founded on kind of an atheistic, materialistic perspective of the human person. And so the first reason to reject it as a paradigm is that it promotes a life and a social structure that suppresses the life of faith, right? Just by construction. It was overtly, communism was overtly atheistic. Okay, so one. Two, and that perspective has implications. So socialism envisions the human person incorrectly, like it's wrong about who the human person is. And so if you build a system off of an incorrect understanding of the human person, that system is not going to help the human person flourish, right? So the church can reject it if it's based on false premises, right? Because it won't be good for humans. And the church, it claims like it has a responsibility to look out for the well-being of humanity. Okay, so then three, and they kind of build on each other, right? Three is that socialism will undermine incentives to be productive. So we talked earlier about, kind of these foundational principles from Genesis that were made to work and to keep, to have dominion, to have, authority over creation, right? And so humans are given this true agency to act in the world and to be God's representative. So in a sense, we can say to kind of conform the world to God's will. And if you have a system that discourages that activity, that will be bad for the world and bad for the human person who's made to live out that mission. Okay, so that's three. And then four, and there's a lot of space on this in Rerum Novarum, is that so in socialism, there is a rejection of private ownership of productive property. And, Pope Leo XIII really elaborates many reasons. I'll pick one, that to deprive people of private ownership of productive property is fundamentally unjust. Okay, and maybe to dig into that, right? So from Genesis, right, if we have a mission to exercise our authority over creation as God's representatives, to bring the world into conformity with the will of the Lord, with our creative participation, then there has to be some share of creation that I have the ability to exercise that authority over, right? So there has to be some share of creation that, in a sense, is mine, and that's a root of private property. And so if we reject private property, in a sense, we are rejecting the social mission and agency of the human person. We're rejecting an element of what it means to have the Imago Dei. So these are principled objections to socialism, rather than like economic rejections of socialism. Okay, so then if we go to the other side, why?
Before we go to capitalism, I do want to clarify one thing here that I think will be important, because while you define socialism early on, I do think sometimes people, one, might have just missed that, and two, there can be a little bit of slippage, in, especially in how I see it used in like American politics, that we don't mean that the community, specifically the state, owns the means of production. I think some people take socialism to be anything with higher taxes than I'd like, and something resembling like a social safety net.
Yes.
And so we even describe like democratic socialism in like Nordic countries, which I don't know if I guess I want to disambiguate a little bit here, not that Rerum Novarum has to weigh in on Sweden, let's say.
You're right.
But just so people are aware, because I think we sometimes use socialism, again, to be high taxes and like healthcare for all. Is that what we're talking about? Or are we talking about something much more specifically that doesn't have private property and has government ownership of the means of production?
Yeah. Excellent question. Yes. So in Catholic social teaching, when it speaks about socialism, it is speaking about this, kind of, I think it actually uses the term true socialism, which maybe we would use the word communism today. Government ownership of the means of production, command and control economies. You are absolutely right that in kind of common conversation, the word socialism has a different connotation. In my perspective, it's misplaced. Like we kind of, the two sides of the American political spectrum, they throw jabs at each other, and the jabs don't always land. Like they're not always accurate, right? So we have a particular way of speaking, and so you're right. The word socialism is thrown around, as if it refers to a welfare state. That's a more nuanced question, and so I don't know how much we want to dig into that. I'm happy to. If we want to, there's some principles in Catholic social teaching that might help us to discern. But when it comes to like the government exercising some responsibility for like social concern through let's say a welfare state, that is a much more nuanced question, and that's not what, in my understanding, what the social encyclicals are speaking about when it speaks about socialism.
I think that's helpful, and maybe we can circle back to it. But at least what I'm hearing is, insofar as we're saying that socialism is completely kind of out of bounds, according to Catholic social teaching, that kind of carte blanche rejection doesn't apply at the same level, let's say, to a welfare state. There's principles, but just so, because I'm imagining someone like taking a clip of this, right, and saying, okay, Catholics reject socialism, therefore, applying it to whomever of the day, Bernie Sanders or whoever, right? Which there's principles to apply, but I want to make sure we're tracking the same thing.
Yes, no, very, very good. Yes. We should zoom in a little bit on the welfare state and try to understand. Okay, should we go for it now? Okay. It is a more nuanced question. So first, if I throw up my spectrum here, right? So let's say socialism over here, capitalism over here, and this spectrum is defined in terms of who owns the productive elements of the economy. Okay. When the size of the government grows in various ways, so even through something like a social welfare system, the government comes to own more of the economy, right? So there's an inching in this direction, right? in my take on Catholic social teaching, the clear prohibition is when we start to get like real far over here. There starts to be more kind of wise discernment in kind of this intermediate side, right? We might start to worry when the government takes too much authority over the economy, intervenes too much in the economy. Pope John Paul II, he kind of directly addressed this idea of capitalism, and he said, well, it depends on how you define capitalism. If you define capitalism as an economy that is, in general characterized by free exchange and kind of a free economy, right? Free decisions to produce or consume private property. If that's how you understand it, then it's a good system. But if you understand it as kind of radical autonomy and not kind of positioned within a moral structure or within a juridical structure that helps to orient the economy towards human flourishing and the common good, then no, it kind of rejects capitalism. Okay. All right. So we're probably going to be close over here on the spectrum, but then how do we decide on the welfare state, social action? Okay, a couple principles, and then maybe we can even circle back a little bit when we get to like subsidiarity.
Yeah.
Okay. So one, the church deeply affirms that the family is the foundation of society. Pope Leo XIII says, the family is the first society and it comes before the state. Okay. And so the social order should be one that supports and affirms the family. Okay, now then the family exists within other social orders, right? So families are parts of churches and local communities, right? And all of these local kind of intermediate institutions also have a really important role in society. Okay, and an important role in terms of meeting the needs of individuals. So when Catholic social teaching kind of envisions how do we respond to social problems, it always begins with thinking about, well, how can the family help to address that social problem? Okay, how can the church help to address that social problem? How can local community help to address that social problem? All right, and then you kind of work your way up from the ground level. Okay. Within that context, the church does affirm that the state has an important role to play in terms of orienting society towards the common good and stepping in to support the poor when the poor don't have any other recourse. Okay, so what you can see in that is that there's no principled objection to the state implementing policies to support the poor. However, it has to be done in a particular way. You get the sense from Catholic social teaching that the role of the state should be kind of remedial rather than normative. And so other parts of the social order should play, an important role, even let's say a dominant role in meeting the needs of individuals. Okay, that's a bit of a sophisticated picture, and I think once we have some of our other principles, we might be able to go deeper. What do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a helpful kind of starting place. And
okay.
It's also going to be the case that Catholic social teaching by nature gives principles.
Yes.
And so for the most part, it's not always going to be this clear cut, do this, don't do that.
Yeah.
For every specificity, it's going to give you kind of the lens through which to have the tools to answer these types of questions. So I think having a sort of like baseline principles there is helpful. I want to circle around to capitalism now because one read of the spectrum, right, is, okay, we don't want, and the spectrum being kind of means of ownership of production, we don't want the government to kind of encroach upon and kind of own all of the production. I think some people hear that and say, okay, so the message of Catholic social teaching is just like, let the markets do their thing. Like government stay out of everything. Let's have like the, just as much liberty and economy as possible, capitalism without any constraints. But it sounds like that's not the answer. And so talk me through how this applies to capitalism.
Yeah, okay, great. So John Paul II, he talks about, he makes a very important observation that the free market does a really good job of allocating resources, right? And that's an observation that I think we see really lived out in the 20th century, right? Communism rose, not long after Rerum Novarum. And then the Soviet Union, the great global power of communism, collapsed right before the 100th year anniversary. And so John Paul II is writing right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and kind of the fulfillment of the warnings of Leo XIII, that communism is not going to work, right? And so capitalism was much more, it's more productive, more honoring of human dignity. It created a context in which humans flourished, just empirically, much, much better than socialism, right? Okay. But the idea that, we say like unbridled liberalism, an unconstrained market, a market that doesn't exist, so in John Paul II's words, that doesn't exist within a strong juridical framework that helps to orient it towards, it's not a perfect quote, orient it towards human flourishing, right? That's what he says it needs. And if the market doesn't have that, then the market will go off into this unbridled liberalism, okay? It's more nuanced because it's both philosophical and kind of structural, which is why it's a little bit of a more nuanced question. But maybe we can say that exactly how we want to instantiate a free market is, how do I say? It enters into the purview of the laity and the kind of the wise discernment. How do we live out these principles? And where do you draw the lines? Right. So in a certain sense, there's an empirical question to it. Right. Now the economists and the political theorists, now we have to come into the room and say, OK, how do we want to live this out? How and in what ways should the market be constrained? And we can take a number of different questions, like where do you draw the line? But there is a general affirmation that, in general, a free market will be more productive and let's say more reflective of that imago Dei, living out the responsibility of doing the will of God in the world, kind of in freedom, right? Hopefully that's not too vague. Maybe as we build up some principles, we can tackle some tangible questions. But
I think that's good, and
okay.
I think that we've spent a good amount of time, I think, on this kind of dichotomy here that's given people at least enough tools to begin thinking about these questions. And I want to get into a couple more principles of Catholic social teaching here, especially within the economic sphere. And it's worth saying, like, Catholic social teaching touches on things besides economics, but we're going to focus the conversation kind of more around this, just given your expertise and how much time we have.
Sounds good.
But I want to go to the, let's say, tension or two things that Catholic social teaching affirms and see how they work together. So on the one hand, we have this idea of private property is good. We like private property, right? And we, from the very beginning of this conversation, we've talked about that. Okay. Yeah. The other is this concept called the universal destination of goods. And I might ask you to give people an explanation of what that means. Yeah. And maybe this will give us a way to kind of wade in one level deeper beyond kind of they're not buzzwords, they're important ideas, but capitalism and socialism, but look at some of the principles underneath that. So private property is good, but what is this universal destination of goods, and how does that relate to an affirmation of private property? Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. I love this setup. I think this is so important. If I can just kind of preface it with a broader thought, perhaps first. We talked earlier about how Catholic social teaching helps to bridge, let's say, the apparent divide between the doers and the preachers. I think kind of how you phrased it. I don't know if you agree, but something that I see is that our country's bitterly divided politically, like deep, I agree. deep polarization, right? Between these two political extremes. And in that context, Catholic social teaching really is good news. It really is good news because it helps to liberate us from the false political dichotomy and all of the polarization that comes with it. So just maybe kind of giving my take, and I promise I'm going to come back to the two principles. My take is that I've seen it in my own life, right? Relationships destroyed because of political polarization. Okay. I think when we say that, when we see that play out, I think what we're looking at is like a political idolatry, right? Where political opinions, economic, opinions, political parties are taking the place of Lord, right? And I find that Catholic social teaching is helpful on a personal level to like convict us to say, no, Jesus Christ is Lord. Jesus Christ is Lord of my political, my social perspective. And one way in which it does that, I mean, partially it does it kind of explicitly. I think it was Pope Paul VI that said, the Christian faith is above ideology, right? So it calls us to go above ideology, which is so refreshing, so needed in the world today. I mean, so needed in our country at least, right? To help people be free of an undue attachment to any political side, right? When we start hating people and lose friendships over our political opinions, Christ isn't Lord. Okay, all right. And so something that is so refreshing about Catholic social teaching is it really forces us to go to go beyond it, right? So we've been talking about this socialism, capitalism spectrum, and it's really helpful. But really, I would say the Catholic social teaching breaks us free from this from this spectrum, or at least this spectrum alone. We're not stuck on this spectrum. It breaks us free from the spectrum. And by doing so, in a sense, Catholic social teaching doesn't cooperate, right? If you read it and you want to be, fill in the blank, social theory, right? Fill in the blank political economy perspective. It's like Catholic social teaching doesn't cooperate because it will affirm things that doesn't fit whichever side you are, right? If you're an American political liberal, you'll read it and say, "Oh, I don't know about this," right? Why are you so friendly to capitalism, right? But if you want just complete free markets, like without the proper perspective, you're going to read something like an affirmation of the possibility. Like so Pope Benedict said, there might need to be a global body with binding authority to help navigate problems like climate change. It's like, whoa, like it doesn't cooperate with our existing paradigm. And so it forces us out of it. It forces us into a choice. Okay. All right. Sorry, that was
that's okay.
that was a primer, but I really think it's good news to help us out of the political idolatry and to help us proclaim Jesus Christ as King. All right. Why did I say that before talking about private property and universal destination? Because that apparent tension is a perfect case of Catholic social teaching pulling us out of this spectrum. All right. So with my hands, I teach with my hands a lot, right? So this is the socialism, capitalism, let's say community or government ownership of property and individual ownership of property. All right. There's the spectrum. And we know that Catholic social teaching falls more on the side of individual, private property. It validates private property. Okay. And it validates private property for the reasons I've, kind of already talked about, right? That we're made in the image of God. We have a mission. We have agency. We have creative participation, in the productive world. And so there needs to be some share of creation over which we can exercise that authority, right? So private property just emerges from that. There's this beautiful line that says, that when we work, we leave a spiritual imprint on creation. Like our work leaves a spiritual imprint on creation, right? And so when we have private property, like this is a domain over which we get to really leave our spiritual imprint, right? And if we're conformed to Jesus, then that imprint is going to look like Jesus, right? And we're going to make the creation reflect God more. Okay, so in that sense, we have to affirm private property. Okay, well then what do we make sense of this universal destination of earthly goods? That sounds awfully communistic, right? Okay, first, what does it mean and where does it come from? The universal destination of earthly goods is the acknowledgement that the earth and all of its bounty, all of its fruitfulness, was made for humanity and not specific individuals. I think it's a St. Ambrose quote that I'm not going to get it right, but it's something like the earth and all of its fullness was made for humanity, not made for the rich. Okay, so So it's an affirmation that all of this abundance that we create with whatever economic system, we're building, and obviously there's, a lot we can learn about what system we should build, right? But all of this abundance is for the flourishing of humanity, for let's say, the two great commandments, right? To love God with all of our hearts, mind, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves, right? To love God, give glory to God, and to love our neighbor. That's what it's for. Okay, so here, so if we're following my graph in the air, right? So if there's a spectrum that's like who has the right to the property, right? That's one spectrum. But what Catholic social teaching helps us to do is add a dimension to the graph, right? If we add a dimension to the graph of saying, okay, fine, we have right to property, but what is that right for? What is the purpose? What is it oriented towards? Okay, and what the church comes down equally as strongly is that private property, that exercise of our authority, the private property, the abundance that comes from it, it is for the common good. It is for our neighbor. It is for love, right? So it has an orientation, it has a goal, it has a direction. And you can see the thread all the way back to Genesis, right? We have a mission to be God's representatives, right? We have a mission to live out, okay? And so what we do with our rights matter, all right? So this adds a dimension to the social question. And it also helps us to then wade through, let's say, the question of capitalism, right? So when we're only looking at the who has the rights question, how we think about capitalism might be kind of confusing. Like, oh, well, where do you draw the line? Okay. But when you add this dimension, what is it all for? All right. What is our rights for? We then can open it up. We can open up how we want to envision the social order. Okay. So universal destination says that like when we labor, like when we leave our spiritual imprint on creation and we produce things in the economy, like when we exercise our productive capacity, when we do that, it's not for us. Like when I work, it's not for me. It's not just for whatever I happen to want. It's not for, bringing us back earlier, it's not for like my radical autonomy. It's not for unbridled liberalism where I just like do whatever I want without any social obligations. No, it has a social obligation. My productivity has a social obligation. And Leo the 13th, the Remnant of Arm, he comes down hard. It's strong. He says that the rich should tremble at the threatenings of Jesus Christ. And then, he quotes St. Thomas Aquinas that like our abundance it's not for us. It's for the common good. It's for the poor. Right? So that gives us our fundamental orientation, right? So if we want to live out, let's say, as JP2 says, he says, well, maybe we shouldn't even use the word capitalism, but we should say a free economy. When we live out a free economy that's abundant and prosperous, we have to remember that as we live that out, we're living it out for the good. That our wealth is for the good of the poor, the marginalized, the common good. Okay.
This is super helpful. So it seems like one of the shifts I'm noticing here is like, and we'll get into maybe distribution of wealth later, but just to hit on it just a little bit here, there's this question of, do people have the right to, own property and be wealthy in that way? And it sounds like the answer is yes, but to use your graph here, it doesn't end there, because I think we often just use that language of like, what can I do? Right? Yes. Should they be allowed to, should people be able to have this kind of wealth? But then it's asking like, but what is the purpose of these things? And the purpose is to give, to be generous. Is that kind of fair with where we're going here? Yeah. Okay. That's really helpful. And then I promise we'll get to kind of the question of the distribution of wealth generally in a bit here, because I have kind of two test cases I want us to go through. But before we get to that, I want to go through one more kind of tension here, and that is this idea of subsidiarity and solidarity. You talked earlier about the family and the community and things of that nature. Some people might be familiar with subsidiarity in that way, like localism, like bringing things down to the local level. But how do we affirm both subsidiarity and solidarity, which I take to be the reason you might see some tension here is subsidiarity seems on the one hand to point us to like, okay, first I'm going to care about my family, then I'm going to care about my community around me, then my church, things of that nature. I'm going to kind of think small, which could divide you in a way from other people. It's like, well, you live in Ohio, I live in Maryland. Like, you're in Ohio. Like, what do I care? You do whatever you want over there. But solidarity seems to say that, like, no, like, you're human, I'm human, and that transcends our zip codes. But I don't even know if that's the right way of expressing the tension, but can we get into kind of those two aspects? Yeah,
that's great. I love these two principles, and I think you characterized the... let's say apparent tension, and we're going to resolve it. The apparent tension between them. Okay. Subsidiarity. Let's zoom in on subsidiarity first. It is an incredibly rich, it's arguably the most interesting of the principles. All right. So we kind of have to flesh it out. It gives us a lot of guidance on how we might want to think about addressing social questions. Okay. And so, we might even see hints of, going back to our conversation on the welfare state, right? We might see hints from subsidiarity about how we might want to think about that question, whether or not we go into it. Okay, so we've laid out this idea that the abundance that we generate through the exercise of our creative participation with God, that abundance is oriented towards the common good, right? So that's private property, universal destination, right? It has an orientation. One thing I'll also add is that private property isn't absolute in Catholic social teaching, so that's maybe another caveat to that story. Now, so the question is, how do we accomplish this universal destination, right? We're going to produce a lot of abundance through the exercise of our authority in private property. How do we then think about making that available through generosity to all of humanity? Okay, so then let's zoom in on subsidiarity, and this will help us. All right, so subsidiarity is a principle that I like to say it asks or addresses two questions. It addresses the who question and the how question. All right. So who is who should act in order to solve a social problem? Like what is the best agent to address a social problem? That's the who. All right. And then the how is how should they go about addressing the social problem? All right. So let's take those in turn. All right. The who. So the principle of subsidiarity says that a social problem should be addressed at the closest kind of social level that is capable of addressing the problem, and the highest social level that's necessary for addressing the social problem. When I say social level, I mean, you can think about it in terms of government, federal government, state government, local government, but you also can think about it in a more rich way that, it includes government action, local community action, whether it's a church or, you name it, social organization, down to the family, down to the individual, right? So subsidiarity helps us to envision society in a more accurate way, that maybe a temptation that we have in our contemporary societies is to kind of view the world as divided between individuals and the state. And subsidiarity helps us to break out of that false dichotomy. It's another false dichotomy that we're liberated from, right? And to recognize that society is actually a rich tapestry of institutions and communities. And we as human persons, again and again in the tradition, it affirms that humans are social by nature. We're not radically autonomous individuals. We're social by nature. We're born into community, and then we live our lives out in community, and our actions contribute to community. So the world is actually a place in which we are embedded within a tapestry of institutions. The state is one of those institutions. The government is one of those institutions, and it's an important one. It sits at the top of the social order, and it has a role in helping to guide the social order towards the common good. And it requires wisdom and prudence to discern how it should do that. But there's lots of other layers of society, and all of those layers have their own responsibilities for the common good. Okay, so once we recognize that, then we, I think, can make sense of what subsidiarity is saying. Subsidiarity is saying that when we have a social problem, we should be looking to solve that social problem at the lowest social level that's able to do it. And along with that, subsidiarity says, the principle of the Pope say, that if a higher social order comes in and usurps a lower one, it's a grave injustice. Okay, we can kind of see this emerge from what we've already talked about in terms of human nature, right? We have agency, creative participation, we have responsibility, we have mission, we have meaning and purpose in our lives. And a part of that is the social implication of our lives. Like, it is good for us to help and to love people. And it is good for people to receive love and not, ambiguous and detached assistance, if possible. Okay. So that's the who question. The who is at the highest social level that's necessary, but the lowest one that's possible that can address it. Okay. Now, sometimes conversations about subsidiarity stop there, but it also speaks about the how, and the how is super important. All right. This is where it really gets interesting for me. Okay. So here's the how question, or the how issue. When a higher social order acts, it should act in such a way that it empowers and enables the lower social orders, not usurp them. I already mentioned that, but kind of elaborate on it. Higher social orders should act in a way that strengthen lower social orders, not replace those social orders. Okay, why? Again, because of our human dignity. Because it is good for us to labor for the good of others. It is good for us to love, and it is good for us to receive love. Right? So higher social orders shouldn't replace lower social orders that are closer to us and more capable of showing love to us, and more capable for us to have ownership and buy-in and to exercise that creative participation. Okay, so that's the principle of subsidiarity, and it has tons of implications, right? And this, I mean, okay. So I co-founded a Master of Public Policy program at Catholic University, where I'm a professor. And our program is kind of built on Catholic social teaching, and I teach a course called Public Policy for the Common Good. And it's arguably my favorite course to teach. I love the class. So the class, in a certain sense, is all about like internalizing that wisdom and then thinking creatively. Like, how do we think about public policy if that's our orientation? Because a lot of public policy is, let's say, naive. It's like, okay, well, the federal government should just put in place this program. It's just, it should just do this, and then that'll solve it. Subsidiarity, again, it's good news because it calls us into greater creative participation, because it helps us to realize that society is a little bit more complex. It's more rich. It's more dynamic than we often can think it is, which then invites us into, for me, an exciting kind of creative activity of trying to discover, trying to explore how should the government act and how should we act in that rich tapestry of institutions. Okay, so maybe I can stop there. I can go further, but maybe I'll pause there.
Maybe we can just put a little bit of like skin on this idea to help people understand it. So just as an example, you mentioned, when you drove here today, you drove through the kind of historic downtown near here, right? That downtown is flooded multiple times, okay? Yeah. Bad thing that happens. So when, let's say, like a local community like has a flood like that, could we apply something like subsidiarity to this, where what does this mean when we talk about levels at which this should happen? What I'm hearing would be like the government has the capability, let's say, to come in. The federal government could be like, okay, we're going to fix up these few local shops that flooded, and because we got people and we got money to do that kind of thing. But what I'm hearing you say is like it shouldn't start at, oh, the government can do it, so they should. But like, what would it look like at a level of something like that, like shops flood in a local downtown as a weather incident kind of thing?
Yeah, great. So this even kind of circles back to some of our earlier questions. Okay, so on my read, Catholic social teaching has no principled objection to action by high levels of social order, like federal governments or even above federal governments. No principled objection. But what guides it is subsidiarity, right? So, the higher you go, the more you have to kind of say, okay, is there a better way? Okay. The flip side of that is another thing that I find so refreshing about Catholic social teaching is that, in our hyperpolarized world, it seems almost as if every social problem we immediately jump to think, well, what should the government do? I think the wisdom of Catholic social teaching is that that's not our first question. That shouldn't be our first question. The first question is like, what do I do? What should my family do? What should my church do? What should my local community do? Right? You work your way up from there. And I think if we flip the script, all of a sudden it activates like our mission and our agency and our creative participation, right? It activates that imago Dei. Okay, so let me apply that. All right, so no principled objection to the exercise of government, but we're kind of flipping the script a little bit. All right, so local flood. So at the lowest level, you have the homes that are damaged by the flood. Okay, so can the family itself address that problem, right? So now we're down to the lowest social order. There are things that a family can do to address the problem. So, in our world, you can have some sort of, insurance, or you can build a house that's up on stilts, or right, you can have sandbags. Like there are things that you can do out of wise discernment to protect your household from that negative event. Okay, now. And this is the nice thing about what I've been saying, is that Catholic social teaching activates that responsibility, that agency. Like I am not exclusively a passive victim to this. I can do something to try to avoid it. Okay. With that said, the flood still happens. All right. Now let's bump up a social order. Right now, all of a sudden, I look in my local community and I look. Okay, there are members of my community whose houses were not flooded. So what's the first thing I can do? Well, if I'm embedded within a rich and a healthy community, well, I have people that I can call. Say, hey, my house just got flooded. Can I come and stay at your house until the flood waters recede? And hey, can we take up a collection at church to help repair my house from the damage? Right? And so I can immediately start looking for those local networks of support. Now, this is where maybe a society that's overly shaped by this kind of idea of like radical autonomy, starts to bear fruit, because when we look in the world around us now, most people don't live in a community that have that kind of network of connection and support. And so the call of Catholic social teaching is go and build it. Right? Like, I'd love to elaborate on this. Okay, use Catholic social teaching to help inform your perspective on politics and how you're going to vote. Sure, great. And if you're really passionate about that, pursue a career, and heck, I can help you, right? But like, if your life is not like a life of like political action, then the mission is different. The mission is you go and build the kinds of communities that are resilient locally. That's the call of subsidiarity. Okay, so then now let's bump up. Now let's imagine that there's an incident that the local community cannot address. Okay, then we have to bump up into higher social orders, right? Then maybe we have to turn to the state government and say, hey, we don't have the resources here to deal with this problem. Will you please come in and help us? And then maybe the state takes some action. Here, I mean, like the word state, not the federal government, but the local, and then if they can't do it, then you go up to the top. All right. Then if there really is no solution, then it makes sense for the highest social order to step in and provide a solution. All right. But now, how should it do that? It should do it in such a way that it reinforces the competencies and the capabilities of all those social orders that are below it. To implement policies that make it easier for that local community to have the networks of solidarity so that next time they can solve it. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So I think that is how you would think through a problem like that, through the lens of subsidiarity.
I love it. And
okay.
What I really like about it too is not just there's one way of thinking of it as like a diagnostic of like, okay, we have problem, which level, select a level, done.
Yeah.
But I think it's much more interesting as we talk about the how level you talked about, and also thinking through how do I create the kind of communities that I want to be in, because and I'm glad you addressed it, because I think people would have this kind of chicken and egg thing where they're like, well, yeah, I want to live in a strong community and this sounds great, but like, that's not what I live in today.
Right.
And so there is this aspect of we have to address the problem as it exists today, but we also don't want to keep repeating the same situation so that we can build stronger communities. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Huh?
Could I build off that just a little bit? Kind of circle back from a point earlier. There's on my read of Catholic social teaching, I think there's a certain thread that the higher the social order you're looking at, the more that we might want to think about it as kind of as a remedial action in terms of maybe addressing acute social problems, or like creating the how do I put it? I don't want to be misunderstood. Like implementing policies that help to create a social order that makes it easier for communities to have those networks of solidarity. But you're exactly right. There is kind of this chicken or an egg thing, and maybe I'll just build on that real quick. If you don't mind, I'm going to go back to my graph. Right, there's another way in which Catholic social teaching helps us to kind of get above this divide. It's not just who has the rights to property, but you see a thread, especially in earlier kind of Catholic social thought, that we also want to pursue a society where the ownership of productive property is widely distributed. That we want a society of owners, not a society where only a small number of people own, right? So you can add a dimension to the graph where it's like concentration of ownership. And there's this thread in Catholic social teaching that says, how do we pursue a society where more people own, more people get to exercise that kind of creative participation in the productive process? And then building off that thread, there's this idea that like when we as individuals are disconnected from community and we are disconnected from ownership of productive property, we're vulnerable. Now, those are exactly the moments when the higher social orders like the government might need to step in, but those are exactly the problems that are created by the breakdown of the social fabric, right? And that makes the subsidiarity so important. For exactly the point, the chicken or the egg, right? That if the state comes in and usurps all of the local support and meets the need directly, that reinforces the breakdown of the networks of social support.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where it takes creativity to try to think, how do we go about our politics? How do we go about public policy to make it easier to build those local networks of support? Okay. So anyways, that was just a couple of additional caveats.
No, that's super helpful because I think whichever direction you go in makes it, it's kind of the object in motion tends to stay in motion. Yeah. If you keep incentivizing the highest level to just swoop in every time, it's going to make it such that it incentivizes it to keep doing that. It gets easier to keep doing it, harder to do it another way. Whereas if you work in the opposite way, it kind of tilts that so it makes it easier, kind of gives those pathways for that ball to roll downhill, to mix like 7 different metaphors into one thing there.
Yeah, love it.
Okay. You mentioned this other dynamic, which gets us to kind of 2 test cases I want to somewhat speed run here of we want to like multiply ownership. I think one kind of contemporary problem that Catholic social teaching could be applied to is this question of the concentration of wealth today. It's something that we see. I mean, is it too dramatic to say like spiraling out of? Maybe that's too dramatic, but like we see a greater. You're the economist here, so but we see such a concentration of wealth among very few and relatively less wealth among a lot others. And one way this also hits home, and as far as private property is like, I talk to a lot of people my age who are like, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to buy a house. Like houses are getting so expensive. So many houses are being bought by private equity, which decreases the number of owners. How would Catholic social teaching and its kind of economic principles help us think through something like wealth inequality and the distribution of it?
Yeah, excellent. Okay. So just to kind of frame it a little bit. So let's zoom in on wealth inequality. And by that, we mean kind of the gap between those who own a lot of wealth and those who own very little. And so I just make that clarification to distinguish between other sources of inequality, like racial inequality. Here, I'm just going to kind of focus on economic or explicitly wealth inequality. So the gap between the rich and the poor. Okay. Also kind of lay the context. Over the last let's say 100, 110 years, we can kind of go back and look at what wealth inequality was like across that time. And what we basically see is that wealth inequality was relatively high at the start of the 20th century. And after the Great Depression and World War II, wealth inequality in the United States and much of Europe declined dramatically. And really, likely at historic lows through kind of the middle of the 20th century. And then starting around 1980, it started to go up again. And it's increased, substantially, kind of back up to where it was at the start of the 20th century. It hasn't kind of continued going up, without limits. It's been a little up and down more recently, but there's a general trend of increasing from about 1980 up to the present. Okay, so there is a very real problem of rising inequality. All right, how do we think about this? How do we think about inequality from the perspective of Catholic social teaching? I think we have to bring a couple of tools to it. First, inequality itself, not a problem. Like, just in principle, it's not a problem. So in Catholic social teaching, there's an affirmation of what I think is observably true. Humans are different. Like, humans have different interests, different passions, different skills, different ages. And because of those things, some people will end up with a larger share of creation than others. So inequality is natural because we're not equal. We're equal in dignity, but we're not equal in activity, right? We do different things, and some things are rewarded more in the market than others, and we have choice in that domain. Okay, so inequality is not a problem in principle. In fact, it's natural. To try to get rid of it completely, to try to make it so we all have the same amount of wealth would be disastrous for the human person because it doesn't map on to real human diversity. Okay. And likewise, in Catholic social teaching, there's an affirmation that if someone contributes a lot to the wealth of the community, and does so in justice, produces good, like quality goods and services that contribute to the common good, that really serve people in human flourishing, that's a really good thing. And if they receive, compensation for that, that's just. That is appropriate. It would be unjust to deprive them of the fruit of the contribution that they've made to society. And you can even see in here kind of the value of a free market, of a free economy, one in which those who have the initiative and the skill to go out and create and to be entrepreneurs and to create goods and services that help and support human flourishing, that people want, that add value, that add wealth, to generate wealth, to produce wealth. That's a good thing, and it's good for them to then receive the fruit of that, to experience the fruit of what they've contributed to society, right? And so in a free economy, they can do that, right? To exercise that creative participation. Okay, so in that context, there's no principal problem to inequality. Okay, well, but what about this inequality? Is there something wrong with the amount of inequality? Like, is there some threshold? Can we say that it's ever too much? Just to put some numbers on the bones, and I wonder, what people will think. Is this too much or not? I just checked in 2025, the 50% of the population with the least amount of wealth. All right, let me set this up. So if we took all of the people in the United States and we lined them up from the lowest amount of wealth to the highest amount of wealth, okay, the bottom 50%, they own 2.5% of the wealth in the United States. Okay. The top 0.1%, they own 14.5% of the total wealth. Okay. The top 10%, they own almost 70% of the wealth. All right. So is that too much? That's kind of a hard question. I don't know. Maybe some people say yes, some people say no. How would we decipher that? And then how would we act upon it? Okay. Here's a few thoughts to maybe help us discern when is inequality a problem. Okay, one, Catholic social teaching, it reinforces a lot of principles. The dignity of the human person, the dignity of work, the social nature of the human person. We flourish within community. We're part of a rich tapestry of institutions, right? We've already talked about, wouldn't it be great if we could solve the flood problem with communities of love, right? Okay. One problem with excessive inequality is it creates a social gap between the rich and the poor to the point where there's no interaction. There's no opportunity for relationship across that gap. And that can be problematic because we're social by nature. It can be problematic because of what I mentioned earlier, right? The universal destination of goods. Our fruitfulness has a purpose, and the purpose is not just our own narrow self-interest. The purpose is the common good. The purpose is the glorification of God. The purpose is the love of neighbor. But if the rich and the poor are so radically isolated from each other, when they're outside of our observation, when we don't know people across the economic spectrum, it becomes really hard to live that out. Okay, there was a recent economic article that I found just fascinating. I'll just touch on it real quick. There's been a long debate of what are some of the major factors of persistent poverty in the United States. And there was a paper, I can't remember exactly how long ago, and the story was like, your zip code. It's where you live, where you grew up. Like that is a major determiner of where you're going to end up socioeconomically. And then there's a more recent paper that kind of pushes on that a little bit, and it shows, and I hope I'm quoting it well, or citing it well, that it's not so much where you come from, but it's whether or not you know someone from another social kind of socioeconomic state, right? So people who have relationships with those that are wealthier, let's just say wealthier, they have a much easier time escaping poverty. Okay, that is so profound, and it's so aligned with the inside of Catholic social teaching because we're social by nature, because we're called into relationships of love. We can help people escape poverty through relationship. But if inequality is so great that there's a gap that makes it difficult to accomplish that, that's a problem. Okay.
That's really helpful. And I appreciate you pointing out the difficulty of this, right? Like, because we might have like intuitions about what is too much, but it's really hard to say what level of that. And it's helpful too, like, as you talk about inequality, I think there's something in us that is like so radically egalitarian that we want everything to be as equal as possible. But I do think you make a good point that like nature is not equal. And again, none of this to say not equal in dignity or value or worth and, at the kind of level of one's soul, right. Their value before God. But inequality isn't something at the wealth level that we can completely eradicate. So it becomes what is too much, which is really helpful. I want to go through one last kind of example to a last test case for Catholic social teaching, and that is AI. Everyone's talking about AI, and something you touched on in your last answer was the idea of the dignity of work, which I think makes the question of AI really interesting because look, we don't know what the future will hold with AI, but there's at least one version of that future that people talk about wherein the vast majority of people, at least let's say like the laptop class, the knowledge workers, if you will, whatever we want to call them, are rendered mostly obsolete. And then some of the things you'll hear out of Silicon Valley, like I think Sam Altman has said, like, we're probably going to need some type of universal basic income because this is just going to take so many jobs and it's going to so radically alter the economy. I'm not trying to say that is what's going to happen.
Sure.
Look, I've got no idea. But if that were to happen, or if we were to think about AI with that as a high level of likelihood, like what does Catholic social teaching say about that?
Okay, really, really good question. I mean, and this is the question of our age. It is interesting and exciting to have the conversation at this moment because as we're filming this, I think in 2 days, Pope Leo XIV, I believe that this is the case, is going to release another social encyclical in which I believe he's supposed to address AI. Right, so this is an exciting moment. I'm going to share my thoughts, my attempt to kind of apply Catholic social teaching, and then let's see what Pope Leo says.
We'll check your work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, go with what is said in the encyclical. Okay, so first, I'm not entirely convinced that it will eliminate human work. And if we have the time, I'd love to elaborate on that. I think there's some interesting reflections in that. But let's first run with kind of the example, what if it massively displaces human work? Okay. When we go into Catholic social teaching, and I think we probably already see the contours of this as, from what I've already said, there is a strong affirmation of the dignity of work. That it is good for the human person to work, right? I said that through our work, we leave a spiritual imprint on creation. It aligns with our dignity. Even more deeply than that, like, we are made with a mission and purpose. And so we long for it. I mean, I think in our world today, people, maybe especially young people, are thirsting for meaning and purpose. And we have one. Like, God has given us a transcendent meaning and purpose to be his representatives in creation, right? And part of living that out is through our work. Okay. And so the church, consistently affirms the dignity of work. Then what do you do if AI replaces a significant amount or all of human work? There is a concern that, the laptop economy will get replaced, but then eventually we'll have humanoid robots that can, build houses and, do the manual labor. And then all of a sudden, what are we going to do? Okay. Okay. So in this context, I would say Catholic social teaching affirms the dignity of work. In that context, I think we have to look for ways in which we can carve out authentic work. Like, we want to find work. We want to find a way for us to continue to live out that mission. And it becomes a matter of, prudential discernment for what role does government play in trying to see that through. I could imagine someone using Catholic social teaching in order to kind of make a case that there should be government policy to protect human work from replacement. I'm not sure that that's necessary exactly, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But because of the dignity of work, I think that's an important conversation. This scenario where we all just become consumers, that is a world in which humans will deeply struggle to flourish because we will lack living out this mission through our work. And so a world in which we all just have universal basic income and we're just out consuming everything that we want, we will not find that that's deeply satisfying. Okay, so maybe I'll pause there. I realize I haven't offered any specific policy recommendations. We can go deeper. I'm also happy if we have time to kind of think about, well, what could the future of work look like as a result of AI? But where would you like to go with it?
Yeah. Let's go future of work, I think, with the time that we've got left here. Okay. So, I mean, there's the kind of, let's say, prudential judgment about whether or not this will actually largely shape the future of work. Mm-hmm. But if it is going to have some impact, what is that going to be? And I imagine that this also, I mean, we don't have to tie this back in, but it has the potential to tie into what we just talked about as well, of the wealth inequality, right? That's right. Because if we have a situation where like the vast majority of people have like a universal basic income and a couple people in like Silicon Valley are making insane amounts of money, we get more of that, right? But let's go future of work.
Okay. And you're absolutely right. It does touch on inequality. Okay, so here, I'm just going to float like a personal reflection, sure. Right? It's going to reflect a little bit of, let's say, Catholic social thought and economics, and it's just a humble reflection. Okay, so it's just me speaking here. In economics, kind of the basic theory of supply and demand. If we hold demand constant, if we just say, okay, how much people want something, if we hold that fixed. When that something is abundant, when there's lots of it, it's cheap. It ends up being inexpensive. When it's scarce, it ends up being more expensive. Okay, so holding demand for something constant, abundance typically, be inexpensive, scarcity expensive. Okay. In that context, so I'm thinking with my economist hat here, in a future where AI it permeates every element of our economy. What will become relatively abundant and therefore relatively cheap, and what will become relatively scarce? That's a question I ask myself as an economist. Okay, well, everything that AI can produce will become relatively abundant because they'll be really good at it. And what AI can't produce will be relatively scarce. Okay, well, what will AI not be able to do? Well, I don't know. I don't know what the future is, right? I don't know everything that AI will be capable of. But here's one thing I think I can say quite confidently. AI cannot be human. I think I can say that pretty confidently. It can't actually be a human person. All right. So if that's true, then in a future economy, there might be a premium on human experience. That is, people might be willing to pay a premium, pay a little bit more to interact with humans or to purchase things that were made by humans. Exactly because it comes from a human, exactly because they value the human experience. And so when everything else becomes relatively scarce, relatively abundant, when everything else becomes relatively abundant, what becomes relatively scarce is what's made by humans and the human experience, and therefore that will become relatively expensive. And that will be the thing we can always offer, is our humanity, is to be that human face. Maybe AI will be really good at administering medical care, but I might still want to hear it from a human doctor, for example. Or, we can go down the line that there is a place for humans to be human and to offer let's say, the service of human interaction. Okay. For me, I think that's possible. Like a world in which there is still work for humans, exactly because we can always be human. All right. Now, if you don't mind, just again, these are my thoughts. That's only if demand is held constant, right? That's only if we want to interact with humans, right? If we want to interact with humans in the marketplace, in the economy, do we want to, do I want to interact with a human doctor? Do I want to interact with someone, working at a cash register, right? Do I want to interact with humans, in all these various ways where we still might be able to interact with them? And here, this is where I think the good news of the gospel is relevant to the AI question. If we're fundamentally oriented by our radical autonomy, and we look at the world around us for how we can acquire from the world what we want from it, if we enter into relationships for what other people give us, not for what we give, which I would say that's a pretty good characterization of sin. I'm not a theologian, but I think sin has kind of a self-orientation, right? If that's what motivates us, I'm a little bit more worried, because I'm worried that AI will give us what we want better than other humans can, because interactions with other humans can be hard, right? In a sense, because of sin, interaction with other humans, real relationship implies sacrifice, and that's hard. And if AI can give us what we want better than other humans can, I'm worried we'll be tempted into a radical isolation and into an economy where we won't pay a premium to interact with humans. For me, if all these various steps are true, it's almost like sin and AI interact with each other in a way that could be really detrimental, right? It's like a future in which we are conformed to that kind of like sin way of operating in the world looks a lot more bleak to me with AI. But then, okay, here's the gospel. There actually is a God, and that God is love. And we're invited to be partakers of his nature. We're invited to follow him, to make the God of the universe, the God who is love, our Lord, and to be transformed to be people who are motivated by love. And if I enter the world and I interact with the world around me out of a motivation of love, where it's not about what I get from other people, but it's what I give, AI can never replace it. I will always want to interact with other humans, because an AI model, a large language model embedded into the circuits of a robot, will never be an object of my authentic love. So I'll always want to interact with humans, and there'll always be a place for humans if I'm motivated by love. And so in my mind, AI is like this opportunity for Christian revival. Like the world, like the world needs to follow the God who is love and be transformed into love, to be transformed into people who live out love, so that we always value humanity, so that we choose to remain human in a world where so much of our experience seems to be encroached upon by AI. And so for me, this is a hinge point. It's a huge moment to share the good news. Follow the God who is love, because our society needs it. Because the future that has lots of AI in it, I think, needs Jesus Christ, needs the lordship of Jesus Christ and the transformation that is on offer to us. That's my personal reflection on AI.
Well, good luck, Pope Leo, one-upping that one.
No. Whatever he says will be better, but yeah.
No, amen. I think that is a beautiful reminder for us, especially when it is so easy to slip away into patterns that don't value humanity. I mean, not to overly moralize this, but as you're talking about what we value, like I think about the decision I'm faced with every time I go to the grocery store, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's like the human there,
Yep.
and then there's self-checkout.
Yep.
Self-checkout's like a little faster.
Yep.
There's no friction.
That's right. That's right.
But, and again, not to overly moralize this, but it's just like a window into this. Like, are we going to be a society that chooses humans and all their messiness, but as objects of love, or are we going to choose screens that keep things as simple and easy for us, but don't actually fulfill us at a deeper level?
Right.
No judgment if you use the self-checkout. That's not the point.
I've used it very recently.
Yes, right? As have I.
Yeah.
But no, Dr. Gallenstein, this has been such a fun conversation. Thank you so much for it. Any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave with people in terms of, if there's a thread that runs through this, if there's one idea you can leave them with for thinking about Catholic social teaching, what would that be?
Yeah, great question. Pope Paul VI had a really wonderful phrase that I think kind of captures where Catholic social teaching is kind of oriented. Like, where does it want to take us? And it's that we want to create a civilization of love. Like a civilization where the animating principle is love, where the animating principle is that we are pursuing love of God and love of neighbor, and living that out in the social order. And I would say that is a fruit of the gospel. It's a fruit of transformation in Jesus Christ, and living that out to pursue, the inbreaking of the kingdom of God on earth, which will be a civilization of love. So I think I would remember that.
Awesome. I love it. I think that is a wonderful parting thought. Once again, thank you for this conversation. Absolutely. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, Austin. I really enjoyed it.